February 19th, 1943. Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. The morning fog clung to the Atlas Mountains as Field Marshal Erwin Rommel studied the American positions through field glasses from his command vehicle. Below him, the pass stretched 2 miles wide between steep ridges, a natural gateway through the Grand Dorsal mountain chain. American troops had dug shallow scrapes across the valley floor, their positions scattered without apparent coordination, their vehicles parked in clusters that presented perfect targets for artillery.
If you found this story valuable, a like helps us share more forgotten chapters of history with those who appreciate them. Subscribe if you'd like to see more. Each story we uncover matters, and your support makes it possible to keep these voices from the past alive.
Rommel had seen this before, in Poland, in France, in the opening months of the Russian campaign. Green troops, poorly positioned, led by commanders who had never experienced the violence of modern mechanized warfare. The Desert Fox permitted himself a moment of professional contempt. These Americans would break like all the others. At 0630 hours, German artillery opened fire. The bombardment lasted 12 minutes, methodical and precise, walking shells across American positions with the practiced efficiency of crews who had perfected their craft across 3 continents. Then came the armor. Panzerkampfwagen och 4 tanks emerged from the morning haze, their long-barreled 75mm guns traversing slowly, searching for targets. Behind them rolled Marder tank destroyers mounting captured Soviet 76mm guns. Armored half-tracks carrying Panzer Grenadier Infantry followed in disciplined formation. The 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions, veterans of campaigns from Warsaw to Tobruk, advanced toward positions held by soldiers who had never fired a shot in combat. The American lines collapsed within hours. Major General Lloyd Fredendall had positioned his forces according to doctrine he had learned at Fort Leavenworth 2 decades earlier. He had split his divisions into small combat commands, penny packets scattered across 50 miles of desert without mutual support. The 1st Armored Division's Combat Command A held one sector. Combat Command C held another, miles away. Infantry battalions from the 34th Division occupied isolated positions that could not reinforce each other. Artillery batteries responded only to their dedicated forward observers, each operating on separate radio frequencies. When German tanks broke through one position, adjacent units could not coordinate a response because they literally could not communicate with each other. The American tanks, M3 Lee and M3 Grant medium tanks, were death traps waiting to be sprung. Their high silhouettes made them visible targets from 2,000 yards. The 75mm gun mounted in a side sponson could not traverse, requiring crews to turn the entire tank to engage targets. German Panzer IVs, lower and faster, engaged American armor from ranges where American guns could not penetrate German armor. The exchange ratios were catastrophic. German tank commanders, veterans of 3 years of armored warfare, destroyed American tanks at ratios exceeding 5-to-1. The infantry fared no better. American soldiers had dug shallow foxholes that offered minimal protection against artillery and none against tanks. German panzer crews knew that shallow positions could be crushed by driving over them and rotating tracks. Soldiers who survived the artillery bombardment and the tank assault found themselves facing Panzer Grenadiers who had perfected assault tactics through years of combat. The Americans who stood and fought were overwhelmed. Those who ran were cut down by machine gun fire. Those who surrendered joined columns of prisoners marching eastward under German guard. Fredendall commanded from a headquarters 70 miles behind the front lines, where Army engineers had blasted tunnels into canyon walls for underground bunkers. He had never personally reconnoitered the battlefield. He did not know the terrain. When the German attack commenced, he could not coordinate a response because he did not understand the situation, and his scattered units could not communicate with each other. His orders, when they came, were confused and contradictory. Units that might have counterattacked received instructions to hold. Units that should have withdrawn were ordered to stand fast. The command structure that should have imposed order instead accelerated chaos. By nightfall on February 19th, American forces had lost 1,600 men, nearly 100 tanks, 57 half-tracks, and 29 artillery pieces. The Germans had broken through Kasserine Pass and were exploiting into the American rear. Rommel, sensing an opportunity to destroy two corps entirely, pushed his forces forward with characteristic aggression. The towns of Sidi Bouzid, Spatla, and Feriana fell in succession. American soldiers abandoned equipment, supplies, and positions in a retreat that covered 50 miles in 5 days. The British 26th Armored Brigade, fighting alongside American forces, fared little better. All 11 of their tanks were destroyed or abandoned. British infantry positions were overrun. The defeat was not merely American, but Allied, though American casualties comprised the overwhelming majority of losses. By February 22nd, when German forces finally halted their advance, American casualties totaled approximately 6,500 men. 300 were confirmed killed, 3,000 were wounded, another 3,000 were missing, most of them prisoners. The material losses were equally staggering: 183 tanks destroyed or captured, more than 500 trucks and motor vehicles, 104 half-tracks, 208 artillery pieces. German losses, by contrast, totaled 989 casualties and 34 tanks. The exchange ratio represented the worst American defeat of the entire war. The impact extended far beyond tactical failure. Kasserine Pass shattered assumptions about American military capability that had sustained Allied planning since Pearl Harbor. British commanders who had fought Germans since 1939 drew conclusions that threatened to reshape the entire war effort. Field Marshal Harold Alexander, commanding 18th Army Group in Tunisia, drafted an assessment that read like an indictment. American commanders lacked experience. American troops lacked discipline. American units required extensive British supervision before they could be trusted with significant responsibilities. General Bernard Montgomery, whose 8th Army was approaching Tunisia from the east after breaking Rommel at El Alamein, was characteristically blunt in his assessment. According to post-war accounts, Montgomery concluded that Americans were hopelessly trained, poorly led, made poor soldiers, and were unlikely to improve quickly. He suggested that American forces be relegated to garrison duties and logistics support, while British forces carried the main burden of combat operations. Winston Churchill, reading reports of Kasserine in London, found his skepticism about American military capability confirmed. He had always doubted whether the United States, with its brief military tradition and untested officer corps, could produce armies capable of defeating the Wehrmacht. Now he had evidence. Churchill's communications to President Roosevelt during this period, while diplomatically phrased, conveyed unmistakable doubt about American readiness for the decisive campaigns ahead. German commanders were equally dismissive, but considerably less diplomatic. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding German forces in the Mediterranean theater, reported to Hitler that American soldiers were poorly trained and poorly led. German intelligence assessments characterized American forces as soft, undisciplined, and lacking the fighting spirit necessary for sustained combat. Rommel himself, in papers compiled after his departure from North Africa, wrote that American forces had shown themselves to be inexperienced and inadequately trained for modern warfare. The mathematics of Kasserine seemed to vindicate every doubt. German forces had achieved a casualty exchange ratio exceeding 6-1. They had advanced 50 miles in 5 days against opposition that had barely slowed their progress. They had demonstrated that American armor, American infantry, and American command structures were fundamentally inferior to their German counterparts. If these ratios held, the Allied invasion of Europe would become a bloodbath that might exhaust American willingness to fight. But one man saw something different in the wreckage of Kasserine Pass. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander in North Africa, reviewed the after-action reports with the analytical precision of a staff officer trained to separate symptoms from causes. The reports documented chaos, collapse, and confusion. They cataloged failures in leadership, doctrine, and coordination. They presented a picture of comprehensive defeat that seemed to confirm British assessments of American incompetence. Eisenhower drew different conclusions. American units had fought poorly, but they had not broken completely. At Sidi Bou Zid, elements of the 1st Armored Division had counterattacked against superior German forces, losing most of their tanks but demonstrating willingness to engage. At Spitla, infantry units had held positions under circumstances that would have justified withdrawal, buying time for other units to escape encirclement. American artillery, when it finally achieved coordination during the latter stages of the battle, had stopped German advances with concentrated firepower that impressed even veteran German officers. The problem, Eisenhower concluded, was not American soldiers. The problem was American leadership, American doctrine, and American coordination. Fredendall had positioned his forces poorly. American tank doctrine had sent armor into engagements they could not win. Artillery coordination procedures had prevented the massing of fires that was American artillery's greatest strength. Air support had been virtually non-existent because coordination procedures between ground and air forces did not exist. These were problems that could be fixed, not easily, not quickly by peacetime standards, but quickly enough to matter in the compressed timeline of war. Eisenhower began his transformation before the guns at Kasserine had fallen silent. On February 20th, while German forces were still advancing, he initiated consultations with his staff about doctrinal changes. By February 23rd, when Rommel's offensive was finally halting, Eisenhower had identified the specific reforms that would reshape American forces. By February 26th, just 2 days after the Germans withdrew from their deepest penetrations, the most rapid military transformation in modern warfare had begun. The starting point was brutal honesty. Eisenhower demanded after-action reports that cataloged failures without euphemism or excuse. He wanted to know exactly what had gone wrong, not to punish individuals, but to identify systemic problems that could be corrected. The reports that emerged were devastating in their specificity. Artillery coordination had failed because each battery operated independently on separate frequencies. Armor had been destroyed because doctrine sent tanks against other tanks without combined arms support. Infantry had been overrun because positions were too shallow and too scattered. Command had collapsed because Fredendall had never understood the terrain or the disposition of his own forces. Other armies might have buried such reports, protecting institutional pride and individual reputations. Other commanders might have blamed soldiers for lack of fighting spirit or subordinates for tactical errors. Eisenhower published the findings throughout the Corps and shared them with training commands in the United States. If American forces were going to learn from Kasserine, everyone needed to understand what had actually happened. The cultural shift this required was profound. Military organizations resist admitting failure. Professional pride, career considerations, and institutional inertia all militate against honest assessment of defeat. Eisenhower's insistence on brutal honesty broke through these barriers not by eliminating them, but by demonstrating that honest analysis would be rewarded rather than punished. Officers who had commanded at Kasserine were not court-martialed or disgraced. They were reassigned to training duties where their experience, including their failures, became institutional knowledge. A captain who had lost his tank company at Sidi Bou Zid was sent to Fort Knox to teach armored tactics. A battalion commander whose infantry had been overrun at Spitla was assigned to the infantry school at Fort Benning. Their mistakes became case studies that taught the next generation of officers what not to do. This approach was distinctly American, rooted in a pragmatic culture that valued results over tradition. British military culture emphasized established procedure and committee review. Soviet military culture punished failure with execution or exile. German military culture, despite its reputation for professional excellence, was increasingly distorted by Hitler's interference and ideological constraints. American military culture, at least under Eisenhower's leadership, emphasized learning and adaptation. The first concrete change came on March 6, 1943. Eisenhower relieved Lloyd Fredendall of command, replacing him with Major General George S. Patton. The relief was not merely personnel change but signal. Commanders who failed would be replaced. Commanders who succeeded would be promoted. Performance, not seniority or connections, would determine advancement. Fredendall's relief was handled with discretion that preserved his dignity while removing him from command. He was reassigned to a training command in the United States, where he received his third star and spent the remainder of the war preparing other officers for combat. The treatment reflected Eisenhower's understanding that public humiliation served no purpose. Fredendall had failed, but he had failed in circumstances that would have challenged any commander. The systemic problems that had contributed to Kasserine were not his alone to bear. Patton arrived at the Second Corps headquarters at 1,000 hours on March 6th. He had 17 days to transform a defeated, demoralized force into an army capable of offensive operations. 17 days to change doctrine, restore morale, and prepare for combat against the same German forces that had routed the Second Corps at Kasserine. The transformation he would achieve in those 17 days remains the fastest large-scale military adaptation in modern warfare. An army that had retreated 50 miles would advance to decisive victory. Soldiers who had broken under German attack would stand firm against the same enemy. Doctrine that had failed catastrophically would be replaced with procedures that worked. The men who had been defeated at Kasserine would prove at Guettar that Americans could fight. But on March 6th, as Patton surveyed the demoralized camps of the Second Corps, that transformation existed only in possibility. The Germans still considered American forces contemptible. The British still doubted American capability. The soldiers of the Second Corps still bore the shame of defeat. The journey from Kasserine to redemption would require not just new leadership, but new doctrine, not just restored morale, but rebuilt competence. Patton had 17 days. March 6, 1943, Jebel Kouif, Tunisia. Major General George S. Patton stepped out of his staff car at 2 Corps headquarters and surveyed the scene before him with unconcealed disgust. Soldiers wandered between tents without helmets. Officers stood in clusters, their uniforms stained and wrinkled, their bearing slack. Vehicles were parked haphazardly, creating bottlenecks that would prove fatal under air attack. The entire camp radiated the unmistakable atmosphere of defeat. Men who had been beaten and expected to be beaten again. Patton had commanded armor since the tanks first rolled in 1917. He had spent 2 decades preparing for mechanized warfare, studying German tactics, developing American doctrine, training the forces that would eventually fight across Europe. He understood armies the way a physician understands bodies. He could diagnose their ailments by observation alone. What he saw at the 2 Corps headquarters was an army suffering from a disease more dangerous than enemy action: the loss of belief in itself. The cure would be brutal, controversial, and effective beyond anything his critics would acknowledge. Patton's first order reached every unit in the 2 Corps within hours of his arrival. Every soldier would wear a complete, clean, pressed uniform at all times. Helmets would be worn, chin straps fastened. Leggings would be properly secured. Neckties would be worn by all officers. Violations would result in fines: $25 for enlisted men, $50 for officers. Repeat violations would result in courts-martial. The reaction was immediate and hostile. Soldiers who had retreated 50 miles under German fire now faced punishment for unbuttoned collars. Officers who had lost men at Kasserine were fined for missing neckties. The absurdity seemed obvious. They were preparing for combat, not a parade. What possible difference could pressed uniforms make against Panzerkampfwagen IV tanks? Patton understood something his critics did not yet grasp. An army that looked defeated was an army that thought defeated. An army that tolerated low standards in visible matters would tolerate low standards in invisible ones. The soldier who couldn't be bothered to wear his helmet properly couldn't be trusted to maintain his rifle properly. The officer who couldn't enforce dress standards couldn't enforce fire discipline. Culture manifested in details, and details determined outcomes. He drove through American positions daily, stopping jeeps and trucks at random, inspecting uniforms, questioning soldiers about their weapons and equipment. He appeared at mess halls, at motor pools, at aid stations. He was everywhere, unpredictable, demanding. Soldiers learned to maintain standards not because they agreed with Patton's priorities, but because they never knew when he might appear. The constant pressure created constant vigilance, and constant vigilance was exactly what combat required. The discipline campaign produced results that surprised even Patton's supporters. Within a week, the slovenly camps had transformed into military installations. Vehicles were parked in orderly rows with proper dispersion against air attack. Soldiers moved with purpose rather than wandering aimlessly. Salutes were rendered crisply. Equipment was maintained. The visible transformation reflected something deeper. Men who took pride in their appearance began taking pride in their profession. Patton reinforced the psychological transformation with leadership that was simultaneously demanding and inspiring. He visited frontline positions, exposing himself to the same dangers his soldiers faced. He spoke to units in language that was profane, direct, and memorable. He told soldiers they were Americans, that Americans did not quit, that Americans would prove every British doubter and German mocker wrong. He promised them victory and made them believe it. The morale transformation was necessary but insufficient. Patton could restore belief, but belief alone would not stop German tanks. The doctrinal failures that had produced Kasserine required systematic correction that extended far beyond any single commander's authority. This was Eisenhower's domain, and he attacked it with the same methodical intensity that Patton brought to discipline. The artillery reforms came first, because American artillery was potentially the most powerful weapon in the Allied arsenal. The United States Army had invested heavily in artillery during the interwar years, developing excellent guns, training competent crews, and stockpiling ammunition in quantities that dwarfed other nations' capabilities. American 105mm howitzers were accurate and reliable. American 155mm guns could deliver devastating firepower at ranges exceeding 10 miles. American ammunition supply was essentially unlimited compared to German constraints. But at Kasserine, this potential had been squandered through organizational failure. Each artillery battery operated independently, responding only to its dedicated forward observers on dedicated radio frequencies. A forward observer with 3rd Battalion could call fire only from 3rd Battalion guns, even if 2nd Battalion artillery was closer to the target or had better firing angles. The result was that American artillery could never achieve the massed fires that made artillery decisive. German artillery, by contrast, could concentrate fires from multiple batteries on single targets, creating sudden, overwhelming bombardments that shattered defensive positions. Eisenhower's staff developed a new fire direction system within days of Kasserine's conclusion. The technical challenges were substantial. Different batteries used different radio frequencies. Fire direction centers used different computational procedures. Artillery officers had been trained throughout their careers to control only their own batteries. The new system required new equipment, new training, and most importantly, new thinking. The solution centralized fire coordination at division level while maintaining battery-level execution. Fire direction centers would receive calls for fire from any forward observer and assign missions to whatever batteries could most effectively engage the target. A single observer could potentially direct fires from an entire division's artillery, concentrating dozens of guns on a single target within minutes of identifying it. Implementation began immediately. Radio equipment was redistributed to create common frequencies. Fire direction officers practiced new coordination procedures. Forward observers learned to call fires using standardized formats that any fire direction center could process. Artillery battalion commanders, initially resistant to surrendering control of their batteries, were convinced through demonstrations that showed how massed fires could achieve effects that dispersed fires could never match. By mid-March, the new procedures were being tested in training exercises. The improvement was dramatic. Targets that would have required 20 minutes to engage under the old system could be engaged in 3 minutes under the new one. Fires that would have involved a single battery could now involve an entire battalion or even multiple battalions. The American artillery advantage, squandered at Kasserine, was being restored. The armor reforms required more fundamental rethinking. American tank doctrine before Kasserine emphasized tank versus tank combat, a legacy of the cavalry tradition from which American armored forces had evolved. Tanks were supposed to find enemy tanks and destroy them through maneuver and firepower. This doctrine had produced the M3 Lee and M4 Sherman, tanks optimized for mobile warfare against other tanks. The problem was that German tanks were better at tank versus tank combat than American tanks. The Panzerkampfwagen V4 mounted a high-velocity 75mm gun that could penetrate American armor at ranges where American guns couldn't penetrate German armor. German tank crews had 3 years of combat experience. They understood how to use terrain, how to coordinate with infantry, how to concentrate fires. American tank crews, trained in the deserts of California against other American tanks, had none of these skills. At Kasserine, American armor had been destroyed piecemeal because Doctrine sent tanks forward to engage German armor without combined arms support. Tank battalions attacked alone, without infantry to suppress German anti-tank guns, without artillery to disrupt German formations, without air support, to attrit German strength before contact. The results were predictable. American tanks burning across the Tunisian desert, while German panzers advanced virtually unmolested. Eisenhower's staff revised American armor doctrine based on these lessons. Tanks would no longer be primarily weapons for fighting other tanks. Tanks would be mobile fire support for infantry, advancing with foot soldiers, using terrain for cover, relying on artillery and tank destroyers to eliminate German armor. The change was fundamental. American armor would support infantry rather than operating independently. Tank destroyers would assume the anti-tank mission. The United States Army had created tank destroyer battalions specifically for this purpose, equipping them with high-velocity guns mounted on mobile chassis. The M10 tank destroyer mounted a 3-inch gun capable of penetrating Panzerkampfwagen R4 armor at combat ranges. The M3 gun motor carriage, a half-track mounting a 75mm gun, provided additional anti-tank capability. These weapons, properly employed, could defeat German armor without requiring American tanks to engage in fights they couldn't win. But at Kasserine, tank destroyer battalions had been broken into platoons and scattered across the battlefield as penny packets. Individual platoons, isolated and unsupported, had been overrun or bypassed by German armor. The weapons were effective. The employment was catastrophic. The new doctrine required tank destroyer battalions to fight as unified formations, concentrating their firepower at critical points. Battalion commanders would position their companies to create overlapping fields of fire. Tank destroyers would engage from prepared positions, using terrain for concealment and protection. They would fight defensively, allowing German armor to advance into kill zones rather than pursuing German tanks across open ground. The implementation required new training and new coordination procedures. Tank destroyer battalions practiced defensive deployments. They rehearsed rapid displacement from one position to another. They coordinated with artillery to ensure that German formations would be disrupted by bombardment before reaching tank destroyer engagement ranges. They learned to fight as battalions rather than as collections of individual vehicles. The combined arms integration extended beyond armor and artillery to include infantry. American infantry at Kasserine had been dug into positions that were too shallow, too scattered, and too isolated. Soldiers had not understood that German tanks would crush shallow foxholes by driving over them and rotating their tracks. They had not coordinated with adjacent units because adjacent units were too far away and on different radio frequencies. They had fought as individuals rather than as integrated teams. The new doctrine emphasized defensive positions with depth and mutual support. Forward positions would delay and channel enemy attacks. Successive defensive lines would absorb penetrations and prevent exploitation. Units would be positioned close enough to support each other with fire and, if necessary, counterattack. Communications would be coordinated so that any unit could call for artillery support from any battery within range. Infantry battalions practiced the new defensive procedures in exercises that simulated German armored assault. They dug proper foxholes, deep enough to survive tank overrun. They positioned automatic weapons to create interlocking fields of fire. They rehearsed coordination with artillery, calling for fires on predetermined targets as German forces advanced through planned engagement areas. They learned to fight as part of a combined arms team rather than as isolated infantry. The air support reforms would take longer to fully implement because coordination between ground and air forces required new organizations, new equipment, and new procedures. But Eisenhower initiated the process immediately. Air liaison officers were assigned to ground units with radio equipment that could communicate directly with fighter-bomber squadrons. Procedures for calling airstrikes were developed and practiced. The principle that air superiority was a prerequisite for ground operations was established as doctrine. The organizational reforms accompanying the doctrinal changes were equally significant. Before Kasserine, Fredendall had split his divisions into combat commands, operating independently across vast distances. The new doctrine emphasized mass. Divisions would fight as divisions, not as scattered fragments. Combat commands would remain under divisional control. Unit boundaries would ensure mutual support. No formation would be positioned where it could not be reinforced by adjacent formations. The reforms cascaded through the Second Corps simultaneously. While Patton drove through camps demanding proper uniforms, artillery officers practiced fire coordination. While soldiers learned to salute crisply, tank destroyer crews rehearsed defensive deployments. While officers faced fines for missing neckties, infantry battalions dug proper defensive positions. The transformation was comprehensive, coordinated, and compressed into 17 impossible days. The speed of adaptation reflected American advantages that other armies could not replicate. Eisenhower had theater-level authority to make changes without waiting for approval from Washington. New equipment arrived within weeks of being requested, shipped across the Atlantic on fast freighters. Replacement vehicles, ammunition, and supplies flowed into North Africa in quantities that would have seemed miraculous to German logisticians struggling with depleted stockpiles. The American industrial base provided whatever was needed. Factories that had been producing consumer goods 2 years earlier were now manufacturing tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, and ammunition at rates that no other nation could match. If something didn't work, it could be replaced. If something needed modification, the modification could be implemented across the force. The abundance of material resources enabled rapid experimentation and rapid deployment of solutions. Other armies lacked this flexibility. British forces in North Africa fought with equipment designed in the 1930s, produced in limited quantities by factories under German air attack. Soviet forces struggled with chronic shortages because German invasion had devastated Soviet industry. German forces were beginning to experience the resource constraints that would strangle their war effort. Only Americans could request new equipment, new vehicles, new weapons, and receive them quickly enough to matter. The cultural factors were equally important. American military culture under Eisenhower's leadership valued results over procedure. If something didn't work, change it immediately. Test innovations in combat, not in training exercises. refined based on battlefield results rather than theoretical analysis. This pragmatism, born of necessity and enabled by resources, created a learning cycle measured in weeks rather than years. British military culture, by contrast, emphasized tradition and established procedure. Doctrinal changes required committee review, formal analysis, and approval by senior officers in London. Soviet military culture demanded adherence to centralized plans regardless of local conditions. German military culture, increasingly distorted by Hitler's ideological interference, struggled to implement lessons learned at the tactical level. American forces could adapt faster because their institutional culture permitted and encouraged adaptation. By March 17th, 11 days after Patton assumed command, Q Corps was ready for offensive operations. The 1st Infantry Division and 1st Armored Division moved forward into central Tunisia, their objective the town of Gafsa, an oasis in the interior plains. Intelligence reported light opposition. American forces took Gafsa with minimal resistance on March the 17th. The following day, the 1st Ranger Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel William Darby pushed ahead to occupy El Guettar, another oasis town 20 miles east of Gafsa. Italian defenders withdrew to the hills overlooking El Guettar, blocking the mountain passes that led to the coastal plain. American forces now held positions that threatened German supply lines. If they could push through the passes to the coast, they would cut off German forces in southern Tunisia from their logistics. General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, commanding German forces in Tunisia since Rommel's departure on March 9th, recognized the threat immediately. American forces at El Guettar could not be permitted to break through to the coast. The 10th Panzer Division, one of Germany's elite armored formations, received orders to attack El Guettar and destroy American positions there. German intelligence officers planning the attack expected to face the same American army they had defeated at Kasserine. They anticipated poor coordination, weak artillery support, scattered defensive positions, and infantry that would break under armored assault. They calculated that a single armored thrust would shatter American defenses and restore German control of central Tunisia. They were about to discover how much could change in 27 days. Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen had positioned the 1st Infantry Division across the El Guettar Valley, according to the new doctrine that Eisenhower's staff had developed since Kasserine. Forward units occupied high ground overlooking the valley, dug into positions with interlocking fields of fire. Behind them, infantry battalions were arranged in successive defensive lines, each capable of mutual support. Artillery was positioned behind ridges, invisible to German observers, but registered on every likely avenue of approach. Tank destroyer battalions occupied prepared positions with clear fields of fire, camouflaged so thoroughly that they were invisible from 100 yards. The 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with M10 tank destroyers mounting 3-inch guns, covered the main approaches. The 899th Tank Destroyer Battalion provided additional firepower from supporting positions. Unlike Kasserine, where tank destroyers had been scattered as penny packets, these battalions would fight as unified formations. The artillery coordination represented the most dramatic improvement. Forward observers occupied concealed positions with clear views of the entire valley. Fire direction centers maintained communications with every battery within range. The procedures developed since Kasserine had been practiced until they were automatic. When German forces entered the valley, American artillery would deliver the massed fires that had been impossible 4 weeks earlier. Minefields had been laid during darkness at locations determined by analysis of German tactics at Kasserine. The mines would not stop German armor, but they would slow it, channelize it, force it into engagement areas where American weapons could destroy it. Every aspect of the defense had been designed to exploit the lessons of defeat. Allen established his command post 3 miles west of El Guettar, close enough to observe the battle but far enough to survive if forward positions were overrun. Unlike Fredendall, who had commanded from tunnels 70 miles behind the front, Allen would see what his soldiers saw and share the dangers they faced. This was not merely symbolic. A commander who understood the battlefield could make decisions that a commander reading reports from distant headquarters could not. The night of March 22nd passed quietly. American soldiers in their foxholes knew that German forces were assembling in the mountains to the east. They knew that the 10th Panzer Division, the same formation that had crushed American units at Kasserine, was preparing to attack. Some had fought at Kasserine and remembered the chaos of defeat. Others had arrived as replacements, their only knowledge of German armor coming from training films and the stories of survivors. They waited in darkness, checking weapons, adjusting equipment, watching the eastern horizon for the first sign of dawn. They did not know that they were about to participate in the first American victory over German armor. They did not know that the reforms implemented since Kasserine would prove their worth in the next 12 hours. They knew only that the Germans were coming, and that this time they would not retreat. At 0600 hours on March 23, 1943, the waiting ended. March 23, 1943, El Guettar Valley, Tunisia. Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen raised his field glasses as the first German tanks emerged from the mountain pass into the valley below. The morning sun, rising behind American positions, silhouetted the German column against the western ridges with perfect clarity. Allen could see every detail. The long-barreled 75mm guns of the Panzerkampfwagen 4 tanks traversing slowly as they searched for targets. The lower profiles of the Marder tank destroyers following in disciplined formation. The armored half-tracks carrying Panzer Grenadier infantry packed tight in their troop compartments. 50 tanks, perhaps more, advancing at speed across 2 miles of open ground with the confidence of veterans who had never lost a major engagement. 27 days earlier, this same division had shattered American forces at Kasserine Pass. The 10th Panzer Division had destroyed American tanks at ratios exceeding 5-1. They had overrun infantry positions that crumbled under armored assault. They had driven American forces back 50 miles in 5 days, capturing thousands of prisoners and hundreds of vehicles. German tank commanders descending into the El Guettar Valley expected the same result. They expected American lines to collapse within hours. They expected scattered resistance, poor coordination, and infantry that would break under pressure. The American positions remained silent. Not a shot was fired as the German column advanced across the valley floor. Forward observers tracked the approaching armor through binoculars, calculating ranges, noting formation spacing, reporting movements to fire direction centers. Tank destroyer crews watched through gun sights, fingers resting on triggers, waiting for orders that hadn't yet come. Infantry in their foxholes gripped rifles and watched the dust clouds rising from German tracks. The discipline was absolute. Every soldier understood that the order to fire would come from battalion, not from individual initiative. Every soldier trusted that the order would come at the right moment. The German column reached the minefield at 06:15 hours. The lead Panzerkampfwagen 4 struck the first mine at full speed, the explosion ripping through the tank's track assembly and slewing the vehicle sideways. A second tank, attempting to bypass the disabled leader, struck another mine, then a third. The German formation bunched as vehicles in the rear slowed to avoid the minefield, tank commanders searching for gaps that didn't exist. The disciplined column became a compressed mass of armor and infantry, exactly as American planners had intended. The artillery strike came at 06:17 hours. American forward observers had tracked the German column since it entered the valley. They had calculated ranges and adjusted for wind. They had coordinated with fire direction centers that maintained communications with every battery within range. When the Germans hit the minefield and bunched, the order was given: fire for effect. Not a single battery, not a battalion. Every artillery piece that could range the target. The first salvo landed among the stalled German tanks with precision that shocked veterans of 3 years of warfare. 100-mile kilometer high explosive rounds detonated against armor, disabling tracks and smashing turret rings. 150 mm shells, each weighing nearly 100 pounds, created craters that swallowed half-tracks whole. White phosphorus rounds burst overhead, showering burning chemical that stuck to metal and flesh, filling the valley with smoke that blinded tank commanders trying to coordinate their response. The second salvo landed before the first had finished exploding, then the third, then the fourth. The bombardment continued without pause, shells arriving at a rate that seemed impossible to German officers who understood artillery logistics. American batteries were firing at maximum rate, crews working with the mechanical precision of men who had practiced these procedures until they were automatic. Fire direction centers coordinated the storm, shifting fires to engage vehicles attempting to escape, concentrating on command tanks identified by their additional antennas. The bombardment lasted 12 minutes. In that time, American artillery delivered more concentrated firepower on a single target than the II Corps had managed in the entire Kasserine campaign. The fire coordination procedures developed in the 4 weeks since Kasserine were proving their worth. Batteries that had operated independently, unable to mass fires, now functioned as a single weapon system under centralized direction. The American artillery advantage, squandered at Kasserine through organizational failure, had been restored through organizational reform. When the artillery lifted, the Guettar Valley had become a graveyard of German armor. Panzerkampfwagen 4 tanks sat motionless, their tracks blown off by mines, their turrets jammed by shell fragments, their crews dead or dying inside steel coffins heated by ammunition fires. Half-tracks had been shredded by high-explosive rounds, their thin armor offering no protection against artillery designed to destroy fortifications. Panzer Grenadier Infantry, who had dismounted to clear mines, lay scattered across the valley floor, cut down by shell fragments before they could reach cover. But the battle was not over. German tank commanders, survivors of campaigns across 3 continents, did not panic under artillery fire. They recognized that the bombardment must eventually lift, that artillery ammunition was finite, that the moment the shells stopped falling would be the moment to advance. Tank engines that had been silenced during the bombardment roared back to life. Vehicles that could still move began crawling forward, seeking to close with American positions before artillery could reorganize. The tank destroyers were waiting. The 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion had occupied positions selected to exploit the terrain Allen's staff had analyzed for days before the battle. M10 tank destroyers, mounting 3-inch guns capable of penetrating Panzerkampfwagen High 4 armor at 1,000 yards, were dug into reverse slope positions that concealed them from German observation until the moment they fired. The crews had camouflaged their vehicles so thoroughly that German tank commanders, scanning for targets through vision slits fouled by smoke and dust, couldn't identify the threat until muzzle flashes revealed American positions. The first M10 fired at 0631 hours, its 3-inch armor-piercing round striking a Panzerkampfwagen I-4 in the hull side at 800 yards. The German tank stopped, smoke pouring from hatches as surviving crew members bailed out. A second M10 engaged another target, then a third, then a fourth. The tank destroyers fired methodically, one aimed shot at a time, waiting for clear targets rather than spraying ammunition in panic. They had trained for exactly this scenario. They knew German tank tactics. They knew where to aim. The 899th Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with M3 gun motor carriages mounting 75mm guns, provided supporting fires from positions on the American left flank. These half-tracks were more vulnerable than the M10s, their open tops exposing crews to artillery fragments and small arms fire. But they were also faster, more maneuverable, capable of repositioning quickly as the tactical situation developed. They engaged German vehicles attempting to flank American positions, preventing the encirclement that had destroyed American units at Kasserine. Unlike Kasserine, where tank destroyer platoons had been scattered across 50 miles and overwhelmed individually, These battalions fought as unified formations. Company commanders coordinated fires to prevent multiple vehicles from engaging the same target. Battalion commanders positioned reserves to reinforce threatened sectors. The concentration of firepower that American doctrine had always promised but never delivered was finally being achieved. The German attack collapsed. By 0900 hours, the 10th Panzer Division had lost 30 tanks destroyed or disabled in the Guettar Valley. The survivors were withdrawing toward the mountain pass, leaving burning vehicles and dead crews across terrain that was supposed to have witnessed another American defeat. German infantry, who had advanced with the armor, found themselves stranded without support, caught between American artillery that resumed firing on withdrawal routes and American infantry that emerged from foxholes to engage with rifles and machine guns. Allen watched the German retreat through field glasses from his command post. His staff suggested repositioning to a more protected location as German artillery began ranging on American headquarters. Allen refused. According to accounts from officers present, his response became legendary within the 1st Infantry Division. "I will like hell pull out, and I'll shoot the first bastard who does." The words captured something essential about the transformation American forces had undergone since Kasserine. 27 days earlier, American commanders had issued orders from headquarters 70 miles behind the front. Now they commanded from positions where they could see the enemy and share their soldiers' dangers. The change was not merely geographical, but psychological. Leaders who stood with their men created armies that stood when standing seemed impossible. The Germans attacked again at 1645 hours, approaching from a different direction in an attempt to flank American positions. The result was identical. American artillery delivered massed fires that disrupted German formations before they could close with defensive positions. Tank destroyers engaged from prepared positions that exploited terrain and concealment. German armor that had terrified American soldiers at Kasserine was being systematically destroyed by an army that had learned its lessons in 4 weeks. By nightfall, the 10th Panzer Division had withdrawn permanently from the Guettar Valley. German casualties exceeded the losses they had inflicted at Kasserine, a reversal that shocked commanders who had assumed American forces would require years to achieve combat effectiveness. The division that had never lost a major engagement had been stopped cold by soldiers it had routed less than a month earlier. The battle continued for 2 more weeks as American forces attempted to push through the mountain passes toward the coastal plain. The fighting was difficult. Italian forces defending the high ground at Hills 369 and 772 fought with unexpected tenacity. American attacks made limited progress against defenders who exploited terrain that favored defense. But the strategic situation had changed irrevocably. On March 26th, 3 days after Guettar, British forces launched Operation Supercharge 2, breaking through the Mareth line to the east. Rommel's defensive positions, which had held for months, collapsed under British pressure coordinated with American operations in the interior. The Axis position in southern Tunisia was disintegrating. German and Italian forces that had dominated North Africa for 2 years were being compressed into an ever-shrinking perimeter around Tunis. On April 7, 1943, American forces from Guettar linked up with elements of the British 8th Army on the Gafsa-Gabes Road. The junction, achieved at 1700 hours after 2 weeks of grinding combat through mountain passes, confirmed what Guettar had demonstrated. American forces could fight alongside British forces as equals, not apprentices. The remaining German and Italian forces were trapped in northern Tunisia, their supply lines cut, their defensive options exhausted. The Tunisia campaign ended on May 13, 1943, when Axis forces surrendered unconditionally. Over 230,000 German and Italian soldiers became prisoners, a defeat that exceeded Stalingrad in numbers captured. The victory belonged to Allied forces collectively, but the transformation that made American participation meaningful had occurred in the 27 days between Kasserine and Guettar. The Germans noticed. After Guettar, German intelligence assessments stopped characterizing American soldiers as cowards or American commanders as incompetent. Reports acknowledged American tactical improvement with the grudging respect that professional soldiers extend to worthy opponents. Rommel himself, reviewing reports from North Africa after his return to Germany, documented in his papers that American forces had recovered very quickly after their first shock and had soon succeeded in damming up German advances. The dismissiveness that had characterized German assessments before Guettar disappeared. Americans could fight. The British noticed as well, though their acknowledgement was slower and more qualified. Montgomery, whose 8th Army had broken through the Mareth Line in coordination with American operations, continued to harbor doubts about American capability that would poison Anglo-American relations through Sicily, Italy, and Normandy. But other British commanders began recognizing that American forces had achieved in weeks what British forces had required years to accomplish. The learning curve that had taken British armies from Dunkirk to El Alamein, a journey of 3 years and countless defeats, American forces had compressed into less than a month. The American military establishment drew lessons from the Kasserine to Guettar transformation that would shape doctrine for generations. The after-action reports that Eisenhower had demanded were studied at Fort Benning, Fort Knox, Fort Sill, and the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. They became case studies in organizational adaptation, taught to officers who would command in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. The specific reforms validated at Guettar spread through the entire American Army. The artillery fire coordination procedures that had delivered massed fires became standard doctrine. The tank destroyer employment concepts that had destroyed German armor at battalion concentration rather than platoon dispersion were incorporated into armored doctrine. The combined arms integration that had synchronized infantry, armor, artillery, and air support was refined and extended. The command philosophy that placed commanders forward, sharing their soldiers' dangers and understanding battlefield conditions directly, became an expectation rather than an exception. The speed of American adaptation became legendary among military historians. 27 days from humiliating defeat to decisive victory. Less than 4 weeks from tactical incompetence to operational effectiveness. No other army in the Second World War, or perhaps in any modern war, had adapted so quickly to battlefield failure. The British had required 3 years from Dunkirk to El Alamein. The Soviets had needed 18 months from Barbarossa to Stalingrad. The Germans themselves had required extensive campaigns in Poland and France before perfecting the blitzkrieg tactics that conquered Western Europe. The reasons for American adaptability were systemic and interconnected, forming a model that other armies would study but struggle to replicate. First, American forces accepted failure without denial or excuse. Eisenhower's insistence on honest after-action reports broke through the institutional resistance that typically prevents armies from learning from defeats. Officers who had failed at Kasserine were not court-martialed, but reassigned to training positions where their experience became institutional knowledge. Mistakes were documented, analyzed, and corrected rather than buried to protect reputations. Second, American commanders possessed authority to implement changes without waiting for approval from distant headquarters. Eisenhower did not need to cable Washington for permission to relieve Fredendall or revise artillery doctrine. Theater-level authority enabled decisions measured in hours rather than weeks. Other armies, answering to bureaucracies in London, Moscow, or Berlin, could not match this decentralized decision-making. Third, American industrial capacity provided resources for rapid implementation at scale. New equipment arrived within weeks of being requested. Replacement vehicles, ammunition, and supplies flowed in quantities that seemed impossible to allies and enemies alike. If something didn't work, it could be replaced. If modifications were needed, they could be implemented across the force. The abundance of material resources enabled experimentation that resource-constrained armies could not afford. Fourth, American forces learned from their enemies without pride preventing adaptation. Staff officers studied German tactics, identified German weaknesses, and developed counters to German techniques. There was no insistence on doing things the American way simply because it was American. Effective methods were adopted regardless of origin. Fifth, American military culture under Eisenhower's leadership valued results over procedure. If something didn't work, change it immediately. Test innovations in combat, not in endless training exercises. Refine based on battlefield results rather than theoretical analysis. This pragmatism created a learning cycle measured in weeks rather than years. The long-term impact extended far beyond the Second World War. The institutional culture that valued adaptation became embedded in American military practice. After-action reviews became mandatory at every level of command. Units were expected to identify problems and develop solutions without waiting for guidance from higher headquarters. Commanders who couldn't adapt were relieved. Commanders who could adapt were promoted. The emphasis on learning from combat experience, forged in the Tunisian desert, became a defining characteristic of American military professionalism. Other militaries studied the American experience but struggled to replicate it. British military culture maintained its emphasis on tradition and established procedure. Soviet military doctrine emphasized centralized control and standardized tactics. The American combination of decentralized authority, institutional flexibility, abundant resources, and systematic analysis remained unique. The soldiers who fought at Guettar did not know they were participating in a historic transformation. They knew they had been beaten at Kasserine Pass. They knew Patton was demanding and Eisenhower was watching. They knew the Germans considered them inferior and the British doubted their competence. They fought to prove everyone wrong. They fought because their commanders asked them to fight. They fought because they were Americans, and Americans did not quit. The fact that they were participating in the fastest military adaptation in modern history was not something they considered. They were focused on surviving the next German attack, on holding their positions, on proving they could stand against experienced enemy forces. But survive they did. And in surviving, they validated every reform implemented since Kasserine, every doctrine revised, every procedure improved. Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen remained at his command post as night fell over the Guettar Valley on March 23, 1943. The German tanks that had emerged from the mountain pass at dawn were burning wreckage scattered across terrain that was supposed to witness another American defeat. The 10th Panzer Division, which had never lost a major engagement, was withdrawing with 30 fewer tanks than it had possessed that morning. The soldiers who had retreated 50 miles at Kasserine had held their ground at Guettar. Allen did not celebrate. There was more fighting ahead. The campaign in Tunisia would continue for 6 more weeks until the final Axis surrender. Sicily would follow, then Italy, then the beaches of Normandy. American forces would face defeats and setbacks in the years to come. But something fundamental had changed in those 27 days between Kasserine Pass and Guettar. The American army that had been routed in February had become an army that could defeat experienced German forces in March. The transformation had been comprehensive. New leadership, new doctrine, new tactics, new coordination procedures, new culture. An army that had tolerated failure had become an army that demanded excellence. An army that had scattered under pressure had become an army that concentrated for decisive effect. An army that had retreated had become an army that advanced. The Germans stopped laughing at American soldiers after Guettar. The British began, slowly and reluctantly, to acknowledge American competence. The American soldiers themselves began believing what Patton had told them, that they were Americans, that Americans did not quit, that Americans would prove every doubter wrong. They had proven it in the Guettar Valley on March 23, 1943. They would prove it again at Sicily, at Salerno, at Anzio, at Normandy, at the Bulge, at the Rhine. The culture of adaptation that had been forged in Tunisia would carry them across Europe to final victory. The journey from Kasserine to Guettar took 27 days. The lessons learned during those 27 days shaped American military doctrine for generations. The men who fought and died in the Tunisian desert created something larger than tactical victory. They created an institutional culture that valued learning over tradition, adaptation over procedure, results over pride. That was the real triumph of Guettar. Not the tactical victory over the 10th Panzer Division, significant though that was, but the institutional victory over failure itself. The proof that armies could change, could learn, could adapt faster than anyone thought possible. The demonstration that defeat was not destiny, but opportunity. 27 days from humiliation to vindication. 27 days from Kasserine to Guettar. 27 days that changed the American Army forever.